Hello and welcome back. We are going to talk about Chapter 3, the visual elements. When it comes to talking about the visual elements, we like to separate them between two types of works, two-dimensional surfaces and also three-dimensional space. When it comes to these visual elements, you'll notice many similarities. When it comes to a 2D surface, it is a plane that can be covered with visual elements. So think of a plane that is flat, a flat surface where we are looking at the whole image at one time. Something like a piece of paper or a canvas used for painting. You can think of a computer screen. That too is actually a 2D surface. Even though we are looking at objects that might or they are three-dimensional, we are basically looking at a flat surface. And the other hand, we have three-dimensional space where they use many of the same visual elements as a 2D surface, but it's not confined to a plane. Something like a sculpture, something that is tangible, something that you can see from different directions. And when it comes to these visual elements, here is a quick list. We're going to break them down. These are things like lines that help depict shapes. There is mass. Mass is usually what describes how much space does an object encompass. You could think about things like space. If you look at the painting that we have here, the background has many different colors, and that is portraying a sense of depth that isn't exactly clear. When it comes to the visual elements, we are going to talk about time. So we are looking at examples of that in this painting again, especially with how the drips are appearing. You can say that it adds an element of time in that the drip is created and the artist allows for it to go as far as it can go. There's also motion that you can see from the figure in the center, a very abstract figure. There are patches of light breaking through. And now when it comes to these visual elements, we are of course looking at color, and there are several zones of texture. And the artist creates texture here using different paint media. You can see some spray paint. You can see some paint created by a brush. And so texture is something that you'll see a lot of in three-dimensional works, but you'll also see them in two-dimensional works as well. And this work is called 008-2, made in 2011 by Daniel Richter. So we're going to, again, break down these visual elements, and the most basic visual element is line. Line is our primary visual means for recording and symbolizing ideas, observations, and feelings. They are the extension of a point wherein length dominates over width. They are these types of paths of action. And we are looking at a photograph here called Bismarck, North Dakota, made in 2002 by Lee Friedlander. The intersection and contrasting paths in the photograph. And so we are still talking about line. Let's take a look at some of these shadows being created by the objects in the scenery. A lot of really interesting diagonal lines. We see a lot of parallel lines and rectangles. So when it comes to things like drawing and especially photography, the artist does whatever they can to create interest by utilizing things like angles, and they do that by looking at the lines. And so here are characteristics of line. They can be either active or static. They can be aggressive or passive. They can be sensual or mechanical. They can define boundaries or imply volumes or masses. They can be grouped to depict light, shadow, patterns, and textures. And here are some examples of lines. We have the actual line, implied line. An implied line is when there are shapes or lines that have a connection somehow, but they are not physically connected, they're not physically visible. And there are lines that create things like value. You can actually group a lot of lines together and they will suddenly look gray. And so, again, look at these different types of examples. There are vertical lines, diagonal lines, sharp and jagged lines. You'll see dance or curving lines. I like to call them gestural lines. And I'll show you guys a little activity on that. You can make the lines hard or soft. There are jagged and irregular lines. And here is an example of a work of art that has some very interesting line quality. Sophie Tabur Arp, movement of colored lines. And you can imagine for these artists that are experimenting with more abstract works, you'll see a lot of creative uses of line. And here's another example. What I would like you to do is to look at the line quality and make a connection, make a distinction between them. If we were to compare these lines to the one that we just saw earlier by the Sophie Tabur Arp, these lines are a little bit more mechanical. They are very rigid and very sharp. Sometimes the artist will actually create lines using a different type of media. And in this case, the artist Anselm Rail makes lines using 119 neon tubes, chains, cable, and 13 transformers. The piece is called Untitled, made in 2006. So once again, when it comes to many works of art, line is probably the most important element. And the artist uses line here again, a very subtle way to create a very interesting space. Fred Sandbeck, another untitled piece. You'll notice that there's a lot of untitled pieces in contemporary art. This piece is made using black yarn, suggesting open rectangles. And here is a example by Kiki Smith called Ginzer, made in 2000. And again, let's look at the line quality here. There's a lot of really interesting textures to replicate the cat's fur. And there's many interesting directionals. The whole shape of the cat itself is creating a very interesting curvaceous line. And so there's, again, many different types of line quality within a work of art. And I'm hoping that you can point these types of qualities out. And now here is a painting by one of my favorite artists, actually, Marc Chagall. And you are looking at a very abstract work of art. You are looking at a series of symbology that are connected to this Jewish artist. You'll see symbology of his religion. You'll see the life of the farmer represent here. You'll see a connection between man and animal. And you'll see some interesting abstract shapes. And this piece is called I and the Village by Marc Chagall. And there are many implied lines here. What we mean by implied line is this idea that there's a connection between one object and another. It isn't exactly a physical line, but it is implied that these objects are connected. And you can say that there is an implied line between the face on the right hand side and the horse in the center there. So if we look at the way humans are portrayed in paintings or drawings, look at their eyes, there's probably an implied line being connecting, making connections somehow. And now we're going to talk about another visual element. And when it comes to these visual elements, it's one of the few lists that I ask my classes to remember. And I want you to remember what all of these elements are. So shape, of course, is one of the important elements. And it can be defined as the expanse within the outline of a two-dimensional area or within the outer boundaries of a three-dimensional object. Shapes can be geometric shapes, where they are very precise, they are regular. It is common to see geometric shapes in the human-made world. So if you see a rectangle or a perfect square or even a triangle, these are shapes that we often see only in the human-made world. Most of the shapes that you'll see in nature are more of these organic shapes. So they are irregular, they're often curving or rounded. Think of the shape of leaves. Think of the waves in the ocean. Think of the way the human body is formed. There aren't really too many rigid lines. There are also biomorphic shapes. They are shapes that suggest a shape based off a natural form. So if there's a connection between an object and that it looks like a natural object, we call that biomorphic. Bio meaning life, morph meaning shape. So biomorphic shape, anything that is connected to life or nature. We see these shapes on a picture plane. Sometimes a second shape is created out of the background area. So when it comes to shapes, we don't often just look at the object itself. We like to include whatever's happening in the background. We can't really neglect the fact that the background creates a shape on its own. So again, when it comes to looking at art, we like to look at things differently. Just try to see them with a little bit more intention. We call figures or positive shapes dominant. In other words, whatever the object is in terms of the emphasis or the subject matter, you'll always see them in the positive space. They're always coming forward, while the ground or negative shapes are in the background. So think of the sky sometimes, or the mountains. They aren't always the focus, so they're usually placed in the background somehow. They are placed in the negative space. You'll hear me use those words interchangeably, and they're basically the same thing. And if you look at this example here, we can ask ourselves, what is the positive shape? What is the negative shape? Maybe the white space is the negative space. It is in the background, while the black shape feels more dominant. It feels like it's coming forward. There are instances where you would think the opposite. It seems like the black shape is more in the background while the white is coming forward. So it really depends on the person, especially when it comes to more abstract shapes. And if we look at this example here, the artist finds a way to shift from positive to negative space. And we are back. I am talking about the work here by MC Escher, Sky and Water 1. We have an artist that is playing around with the idea of shifting from the positive space into the negative space and vice versa. We call this a type of figure ground reversal when our awareness shifts between shapes. With this work here by Katharina Gross, an untitled piece, there are subtle shifts from the positive and the negative space. So it's very difficult to describe what might be coming forward, what might be pushing back there. The artist does this by using stencils, actually, a type of imagine having a cardboard or paper and you're cutting a shape through it and then you're painting within it. That's what a stencil is. We'll actually talk a lot about that when we talk about printmaking in a future chapter. And we're going to talk about another element, visual element here. Sorry about that. I got a delivery. Anyhow, we're going to talk about mass. Mass is this physical bulk of a solid body of material. Mass can also be defined using volume when mass encloses space. And if we look at this object here, Fernando Botero, the horse made in 2008, made in bronze, very large piece, you can see that mass really plays its role when it comes to things like sculpture, because we are looking at the object, we are imagining how it would feel to be close to the object, to physically touch the object, to witness the size and the mass. And so this is a type of closed form sculpture where it does not interact openly with the surrounding space. In other words, the object is basically the object itself. There are different types of sculptures where they interact a little bit more with its surrounding environment, but in this case, it doesn't exactly do that. So when sculptures are that way, we call them closed form. They're not exactly interacting outside of their environment. And when it comes to these sculptures, you can say that when there is little solid material, it suggests that the work is more linear form than mass. So it's not really about the size of the object, it's more about the lines that are being created. And we'll see these in these types of open form sculptures. And let me see, I'll be right back. Okay, I had to close my door for a moment because I have a lot of commotion. I have guests over. I have in-laws over. Oh my God. And so when it comes to open form sculpture, we are looking at sculptures that interact with the surrounding space. And this work here by Alberto Giacometti, Man Pointing, made in 1947, made from bronze, a very tall sculpture, very tall and narrow sculpture of the human form. And one thing I like to ask my students is, why would a person portray the human form in this manner? What I mean by that is when people draw one another, when they make paintings of people, when they take photographs of each other, or even when they make sculptures of another human, we have a tendency to make everything idealized. We have a tendency to make everything look beautiful. We have a tendency to make everything look perfect. But in this case, Alberto Giacometti, he portrays the human form in a different manner. And that can be described as rough, look at the textures on this sculpture here. The figure itself is very narrow. It's very thin in comparison to what an average human may appear like. The object is also very tall, and that too gives it somewhat of an inhuman quality. And you would wonder, why would someone portray the human form in this fashion? And I can tell you that I don't really like to give away I don't really like to give away my translation of what the work might be, but I feel that it is a reflection of himself. Perhaps Alberto Giacometti looked at his life as very fragile. Maybe he is very vulnerable. Maybe he's physically or mentally weak. So there are many different reasons why a human or why someone would portray the human form this way. And when it comes to mass, it doesn't always have to deal with three-dimensional works. We can see mass being portrayed in two-dimensional works such as this. And this is by Elizabeth Catlett. The work is called Bread, made in 1962. And the artist creates mass using lines and dots, actually. So even though we are looking at a two-dimensional surface where the plane is actually flat, the artist finds a way to create mass using these types of techniques. And now we're going to talk about another visual element, space. Space is this indefinable general receptacle of all things. Space is seemingly empty. When we look at works of art, especially in sculptures, works in three dimensions, we are actually experiencing the work with our bodies. So it is making a connection with our personal space. It is interfering with our protected boundaries. You can see these types of qualities when you think about architecture, where the artist or the architect designed a space to give it a certain character. And in this example, the North Terminal of Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, made in 1997, designed by Cesar Pelli and Associates. And we are looking at the interior of this airport, and you can imagine that the designers had space in mind. When you walk into an airport, you'll notice that the ceilings are super high. They're usually very, very, very tall. And they do that purposely for the sake of creating a special environment for those who are traveling. They want to make you feel like you're already in the sky, that you are interacting in this open space, and that it gives you a very memorable time of being in the airport, and it makes you want to travel more. So aside from the interior, the airport was created near the Potomac River and also the Washington Monument. So not only are they thinking about space within the architecture, but also outside. So when it comes to design and these buildings, they have so many things that they think about and they plan just to, in a way, elevate our experience. And here is an example of an installation piece where the artist has a room in a museum, Doug Wheeler, and that he basically creates these lights that illuminate the corners of the wall. And it creates a very infinite space, a very quiet space, a very calming space, and you can imagine being in this area and really having the artist bring us to a different type of feeling. And that's why space is so important when it comes to these visual elements. When it comes to space in more two-dimensional works, we're actually looking at the work all at once. And that is the main difference between space on a 2D work and space in a 3D work, where we actually had to interact with it more. But on a 2D surface, we're actually looking at the whole thing all at once. And so despite us looking at a work of art on a 2D space, the artist finds ways to manipulate things like space that is being implied. We are physically limited by the height and the width of that 2D surface, but the artist again adds and takes away things to make the image have more depth. And in this work of art here, it's actually ancient Egyptian. Pool in the garden made in 1400 BCE, paint on dry plaster. You'll notice that when it comes to ancient Egyptian art, a lot of the drawings are rendered very flat. They're even accompanied by an outline when drawings are made or when paintings are made, and if there is a physical line outside of the object, it makes it even more flat. And so in ancient Egypt, they had this static style where they basically drew and painted and sculpted the same way through centuries, and that it was something that they tried to maintain in their kingdom. And so the ancient Egyptians, they knew how to draw and paint, obviously, but they didn't really intend to create a more believable space in comparison to something more recent where many artists attempt to make everything look real. In the past, many artists actually chose not to. And try to watch these links that I'm posting on modules, because it gives you more insight. For you to just listen to my lecture and to take notes is really good, but I think that if you were to look at these things one by one, it just gives you a little bit more info that you can relate to when it comes to taking things like the exam. You'll have a little bit more info to revitalize your memory. So that's just a little bit of advice. Some students are really good at taking notes, which is fine, but I think that in an online environment like what we have now, it's a little bit better to hear it from 2 or 3 sources. So for you to listen to my lecture is totally fine, but I think that if you had these other resources, they can inspire you a little bit more. And so when it comes to space, there's an implied depth, and that's what I mentioned earlier. The artist find ways to create depth, but something about that is we are learning spatial depth at a very early childhood. So we can tell how far something is, or we can tell how close something is just from looking at it. If it's 3D or flat, it feels like we can in a way gauge what is the depth or the distance between the viewer and the object. And here are different methods that artists use to imply depth in their works. They do overlapping of the objects. They also draw objects and paint them using diminishing sizes. And so if you draw, say that you are drawing an apple, if you draw an apple that's, in the center of your paper, that's, somewhere in the middle, but if you draw the same apple but you make it a little bit smaller, then it feels like it's further away. Assuming that the apple is the same size. And so another way to make objects portray a sense of depth is by vertical placement. And that is when the objects are higher on the composition. They are higher on the 2D surface that we are looking at, so it feels like it's further away. So things that are close to us are lower to the ground or lower to the bottom of the work of art, while the objects that are on the top portion feel like they're further away. And artists can actually combine all of these different things. They can overlap the objects, they can do vertical placement, they can do diminishing size. And again, artists can emphasize either reality of a flat surface or the illusion of depth. Artists, they can choose to make it flat. They can choose to give it depth depending on the style of the artist, of course, their abilities, what they studied in terms of how to create more depth in your drawing. And if you're interested in learning these different techniques, I would suggest taking a drawing class. Maybe my drawing class has open seats in the fall, so yes, yeah, think about it. So artists can create depth, and you can see the artist does a few things here. Paul Cézanne. Cézanne is a very popular artist. He was alive and popular during the time Van Gogh was alive, and also the artists like Picasso and Renoir, and many of these popular artists that we're going to talk about, they were actually alive during the same time, and we're actually going to talk a little bit about that later. And so Cézanne, he does your basic still life painting using apples. And a still life is where the artist basically arranges these objects on a setting of some sort and just use the setting as a way to practice his craft and get better at drawing, get better at painting and capturing reality, and so on. And when it comes to space, there is this system called linear perspective. Perspective refers to any means of representing a three-dimensional object in space on a two-dimensional surface. The linear perspective system was developed during the Italian Renaissance. So this was around the 1400 CE. So around that time. That is when the Italians at the time were very inspired to push things like representationalism in art. They really wanted to hone down whatever they can to make the paintings look beautiful. And that's why many of us know who Da Vinci is, because he was a great master in creating depth and realism using a technique such as this. And we're going to talk a little bit about that eventually. So the linear perspective system developed during the Italian Renaissance, it is based off of the way we see. They are based off of these lines that converge to a vanishing point. And what does that mean? Or what that means is, if you can imagine, if you are driving down the highway, you are noticing that, say that you are driving down the highway, maybe you are driving on Highway 99, and that you are looking in front of you, you'll notice that if you were to look around you, the street that you're on, the closest to you is basically encompasses a lot of your peripheral view. You can see a lot of whatever is happening around you. You can see many details, but if you were to look down the highway, you're looking down the freeway, and that you'll notice this the road getting thinner as it gets further away. It gets more narrow. Sorry, it gets more narrow as you look further into the distance, and that will eventually stop. You'll not be able to see further than whatever that point is, and that is the vanishing point, when everything seems to get very small and you can't really see anything anymore. And of course, because of the distance, there's a lack of clarity, and that's actually another type of perspective that we're going to talk about. Whenever it comes to the vanishing point, it's usually based off of something on the horizon line. The horizon line represents the eye level. So if you can imagine looking out, say that you are at the beach and that you are looking out into the ocean. If you were to see where the sky is meeting with the ocean, that connection, that line, that's the horizon line. So think horizon when it comes to this idea here. And usually when it comes to painters and artists during the Renaissance, they can imagine that horizon line and make these lines go towards that. When it comes to the linear perspective system, it is usually created by having a fixed position or a vantage point. So the vantage point is, if you can imagine the the distance or the area that you are looking the distance you are looking at an object from, or the area where you're looking at an object from. So say that you are you are at home, and say that you have a two-story home, and that you want to see if your packages are arriving. So you're going to have a good vantage point. You're going to be at a high spot. You're going to look down at the road. You're going to look for that UPS truck. You're going to see whether or not that car is going to come by to drop off your goodies. And so you need a good vantage point. You want to be able to see from a particular area. So the artists, they depend on this a lot, because they're actually drawing and painting from observation. In other words, they are painting and drawing what they are seeing right in front of them. They are not like artists in today's standards, where, or more like students, where they're just painting from or drawing from a picture. So yes, during the Renaissance, they drew from observation. And here's an example of one point perspective being used. And I'm looking at the top part now. So you'll see that the objects get smaller as they get further into the distance, assuming that those objects are the same size. So if you were to look at the trees, you'll notice that they're getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And sooner or later, you can't really see them anymore. So one point perspective actually works for objects that are above the horizon line. If you look at the second image here, that the lines that are parallel to the ground, they will connect to the vanishing point somehow. So imagine the top edge of a building, and say that there are rows of buildings connected. You'll notice that they are forming a type of line. And that's what is being done when they are using one point perspective. They're trying to mimic what they see in reality. And there's also another type of perspective called 2-point perspective. That is the bottom image there. There are two vanishing points instead of one. And you can imagine this if you were to be standing in front of a city block, and that you are standing in front of a tall building, and that you are looking one direction down the street, and then you're looking another direction down the street. And so we have two areas that seem to have vanishing points. Okay, so there are two different types that I'll ask about. There's actually multiple point perspective as well. There's more than one. There's more than two sets of vanishing points. Imagine looking up or looking down in a say that you are on the top of a building, and that you are looking down you'll see another vanishing point that leads you to the earth. And say that you are at the bottom of a very tall building. If you were to look up, that you can see that the top of the building is very narrow, and that is another vanishing point being created there. So I'm going to go ahead and pause this here. Or you know what? I'm just going to keep going. Let's talk about this painting here. You can see that the artist is using linear perspective because of the lines in the pillars, the lines on the ground, that they are converging towards the center here. And usually they converge to a type of focal point. Perhaps these subjects in the very center are the main people of the overall composition. So all of these lines, even the lines on the architecture, they're all leading towards the very center here, more like low, a little bit lower from the center. And this painting is called The School of Athens, made by Raphael, 1508. This is actually during the High Renaissance. Very large painting, a fresco painting, approximately 18 feet by 26 feet. So everything in the image was painted in accordance to the one-point perspective system, all except for the cube in this lower center there. Yes, I agree that it doesn't really look like it was drawn or painted in connection with the rest of the composition, but still very believable, still very realistic. And if you were to remove the figures, this is what we would actually see. You can see how these lines are converging towards the negative space there, towards the vanishing point in the very center, well, close to the very center. And another type of perspective we're going to talk about is the atmospheric perspective or aerial perspective. This is a non-linear means of giving an illusion of depth. This is created by color, value, and detail from the visual experience of the real world. And when it comes to this atmospheric perspective, it is caused by this increased quantity of air, moisture, and dust. Faraway objects are bluer and less distinct. And imagine that it is a little bit, say it's winter time and it's a little bit foggy, and you'll notice that if you were to try to look far into the distance, you won't see too many objects clearly. You'll be obstructed by things like fog, of course, and that it only gets more gray as you look further into the distance. And that's what atmospheric perspective does. And so the artists, they try to mimic this idea in their paintings to give the space a little bit more believable depth. So the objects that are further away have less clarity, while the objects that are a little bit closer to you, the viewer, have stronger amount of detail. And you can see that in this vast landscape painting here. Very realistic. Not only are the colors and the objects true to proportion, but also the way the artist uses color, and that the artist had atmospheric perspective in mind when it came to rendering the space here. So if you were to look at the objects that are closer to us, the trees and the branches and the leaves around the lower portion of the painting, the contrast of the colors are a lot stronger. The darks are very dark, and the lights are lighter, and the yellows are more vibrant, and so are the things like the greens in the trees. But if you were to look at the mountains in the distance, they have less clarity. They look a little bit more faded, and right away you're seeing the artist using this idea of atmospheric perspective to create a little bit more believable depth. And if you look even further into the distance, the the tall mountain in the background is just a little bit darker than the clouds, so it's almost as blue as the sky already. So this is a prime example of how an artist uses atmospheric perspective. Asher Brown Durand, Kindred Spirits, made in 1849. And when it came to atmospheric perspective, there's a lot of credit given to the Western world, a lot of credit given to the Italians during the Renaissance, but when it came to other cultures, they were actually already doing something like that in their work of art, such as the ink scroll paintings in China. And you can see that there is an atmospheric perspective effect happening here. Despite the artist just using ink, just using blacks and whites, the artist still finds a way to fade the objects that are further into the distance, making it making the space more believable. And this piece is by Shen Zhou, Poet on a Mountaintop, from the series Landscape album 5 Leaves, 1500. And we're going to jump into another element now, another visual element, time and motion. It is this invisible fourth dimension in which events occur in succession. It is the passage of time. When it came to things like more indigenous works, especially in the ancient Aztec culture, time was being portrayed as a cycle. So this is actually a calendar, an Aztec calendar made in 1479. Something about the Aztec culture and this idea of time. Everything happens at a particular, a similar place in time. In other words, if something happens, there's going to be that same thing that's going to happen again eventually. And that that life is this ongoing idea of that cycle, just like making parallels to life. People, they are born and then they live and then they die, and so it's just this ongoing cycle. And so the Aztec calendar is based off of those ideas. The sun comes up and then it reaches the top of the sky, and then it eventually goes down, and then it's nighttime, and then it's the same cycle over and over again. And so not only are these physical things happening within the Aztec calendar, but also the events, things like war will happen, wartime will happen, and then it'll go away, and then it'll happen again, and then it'll go away. And so it's this ongoing cycle. It's very different from what is defined as time in the Western culture, where it's more linear, where you can say that you could think about the time that we're living now, 2020, hoping it's 2020 by the time you guys listen to this. Let's see. I lost my chain of thought. And so this idea of linear time in the Western world is that, okay, we're living in 2020 AD or CE, meaning Christ era. And so this era of time began when Christ came. And so that is the beginning of this time. And then who knows, that this era might end and that humanity will enter a new era. And so yes, time is portrayed very differently in the Western culture in comparison to these more indigenous cultures such as the Aztecs. And in this painting, and just to add on more to how we were talking about Western world and Christianity quite a bit, we have the meeting of Saint Anthony and Saint Paul, made in 1440, made by the artist Seseta, and we are looking at a painting, but you'll notice that it is actually of the same figure portrayed in different scenes within that a story told in the Bible. And so we have a time-oriented painting where this happened first and then this happened next, and then in the bottom is where the story in a way ends. So the upper left-hand corner, that is the beginning of the story. This story of Saint Anthony, that he is a very devout man. He was a very early follower of Christ, and that he received a divine message somehow, saying that it's okay to live the way you are. You're living as a hermit because there's not too many people who believe in the same thing as you. So you should go out and try to find people who are like you. And so on after he heard this divine message, Saint Anthony went out and started a quest of his own. He came upon a creature, a type of centaur creature, where it was half man and half horse, and this beast wasn't really there to attack him. Instead, the beast helped guide him the right direction. You should go this way. And forgive me if I'm saying this wrong. I haven't studied for this chapter yet, but I'm remembering what I can. And so correct me if I make any mistakes, please. And so this creature helps Saint Anthony, tells him to go this way, and so eventually he finds this other person, and that his name is Saint Paul, and that he too was actually very similar to Saint Anthony, and that they were both these hermit type of people, where they were living away from the rest of humanity to practice and follow their religion. And so yes, a very interesting portrayal of the story of Saint Anthony and Saint Paul. And a little bit more about time and motion. Film and television, of course, must be included because they are very much based off of this idea of time. And when it comes to television, you can say that time doesn't need to be linear, but it can be manipulated. In other words, you won't really see you won't really see the story pan out from the very beginning to the very end. You'll see many instances where you'll see scenes of the end, and then you'll go back to the beginning, and then you'll watch the story progress, and then it'll go even further into the past, and then it'll give you more. Anyhow, time is very important when it comes to television. And an artist actually uses this idea of playing around with time in his piece called The Clock, Christian Marclay. And there's an image of that in this PowerPoint. I'll get to it in just a little bit. And so we're talking about time and motion. Of course, we have things like comic books. They portray images in drawings from one scene to another. They are also accompanied by text. So for the most part, you're reading comics from the upper left-hand corner, making your way to the right, and then you're going a little bit lower. You're going to the right, and then eventually you'll reach the bottom. And so for many people who are, if you like superheroes and such, I'm guessing that you probably read comic books, and that's really cool. I actually grew up collecting comic books for a pretty good part of my youth. I don't know if I still have them. I'd have to look at my parents' house, but yes, comics are really exciting, in that it's a really interesting way to be engaged in a story through a different medium. You don't have to be given all the information. Instead, you're you have this storytelling, and then the picture is just there to give you a little aid of what's going on. So comics use and manipulate the sense of time in many ways. And this is what I was referring to earlier. Christian Mark Clay, The Clock, made in 2010. So the artist actually finds different scenes from different television shows and movies with the clock in it somehow, and that he splices up that that section, and he adds it to this collection where every scene has the clock in it, and that it can be from, you know, an action movie, it can be from a drama, it can be from a TV show, it can be from, you know, like a kids show, it can be many things. So the artist actually spent so much time finding these different scenes, splicing it all up and putting them all together. And objects can also have a type of implied motion. So there's movement itself as a subject or central quality of the subject. So the object has something that deals with motion. And in this work here, the dancing Krishna, he's portrayed or she's portrayed in a dynamic, energized pose. This is 1300. Krishna is one of the most important deities in the Hindu religion. Krishna, if I can remember, Krishna is the god of, I want to say god of love and of humor. You'll always see Krishna happy because he's a very playful person. He's always dancing. And something about the Hindu religion is this, if for any of you who have tried yoga, a lot of the roots of yoga started in Hinduism and Buddhism. And so you'll see their religious figures portrayed in these mystical poses. This sense of balance is very important in their culture. So it seems like the whole body is moving, creating this beautiful dance shape, but at the same time maintaining balance. And so when it comes to implied motion, you can say that the work doesn't have to have a physical person portraying the emotion. Instead, it can be created just from lines. And the artist does that here. Baccioni, Umberto Baccioni, the dynamism of a human body, footballer. So it's actually of an athlete. And this was made during the Futurist movement. The Futurist movement is an interesting time where writers, artists, they were very inspired by the unknown future. They were inspired by technology and the possibilities of humankind. So it sounds very familiar to the sci-fi genre. If you like to watch movies that deal with those kinds of ideas, that's what futurism was all about. Except this was over 100 years ago. This was during the 1900s. So you'll see a lot of artists shifting to a different style of drawing and painting, and there's always something that deals with movement. And here we have an example of an artist using text, light boards populated with sayings of her own invention. So what Janie Holzer does, she'll find these publicly used tickers or these publicly used signs, and she'll manipulate them to have her own message. And so she actually would talk about messages of feminism, of basically things that she wants to change when it comes to society in general. So Jenny Holter is actually a very interesting artist. I don't know if she does a lot of work like this still. And if you can imagine being in a large city, and if there were many tickers that have, buy food here, get gas here, slow down because there's traffic. Instead, it'll say something else. It'll say something basically of her own opinion. And I don't know if it's legal or not, but it's a way for her to relay these messages, to get a message across. Sometimes there are works of art that have actual motion, and they can be things like sculptures that have movement involved somehow, like fountains, kites, banners, or flags. And this is a work by Alexander Calder. The piece is called Untitled. It is an example of kinetic art in which actual motion is a major feature of the artwork. So it looks like a type of weather vane. So this is inside of a gallery space. You can probably guess that when people enter the museum, when the doors open and close, it's just enough to create a little bit of air traction, and it'll make these objects revolve a little bit. And so anything that deals with movement, actual movement, is called a kinetic art. We are going to talk about light now. Natural light contains all the colors that make up the visible part of the electromagnetic spectrum. When we are seeing light, the way light falls on a subject influences how the viewer sees it. And we have a work here by Daniel Chester French, the Lincoln Memorial detail, made in 1911 and 1922. We can see how light influences the object, especially when it comes to looking at sculpture, because you're looking at different textures, different angles, different shadows. When we say the word value when it comes to art, we're actually talking about the amount of lightness and darkness. You can think of it as the whites to grays to black. Sometimes there is a property of color, or the tone itself is independent of a color. We are looking at an example of implied light. You can see that the center line is of one particular shade of gray throughout the whole bar, and depending on the light and or the dark underneath it, it actually influences the way we see that middle gray. So the middle gray looks a lot darker when it's above a light area, and it looks very light when you look at that gray with a very dark area underneath it. And we have an example of an artist using darks and lights to create form. Rosa Bonheur, Harvest Season. We have all values from light to dark, showing volume as mass through shading. This is an example of chiaroscuro. Chiaroscuro means light and dark. It is one of the few foreign words that I'm going to ask you guys to remember. You'll hear chiaroscuro used a lot whenever a work of art is basically lights and darks. When artists use light, they can actually use the light itself as the medium, and that's what the artist does here. Keith Saunier on Motordom. He is creating this installation of a light that mimics this car culture of Southern California. So you can imagine the artist was inspired by seeing many cars pass by, or that he's driving through the freeways and seeing all of these cars passing through, and he recreates that in this little area here, this little garage. And now we're going to talk about color. So we can't really see color without light. And so a component of light that affects our thoughts, moods, actions, and even health is what color is. There are certain established cultural customs for color, such as in the Italian Renaissance and Leonardo da Vinci's representative colors. There are things like the Virgin Mary, where she's usually portrayed wearing blue. You'll see things like the color green that symbolizes fertility. So we have a lot of different cultural symbolism when it comes to color. In North India, there are a lot of different characteristics that come with color. So when it comes to the physics of color, objects that appear to have color are merely reflecting the colors that are present in the light that illuminates them. So when it comes to color, we are actually looking at the light bouncing off of that particular surface. If you notice, if you are in a very dark room, there are no lights on, you'll probably not see color because there is no light. And if you can imagine a light shown, say, underneath your door, if you were to slowly open it, then you can slowly start seeing different colors because the amount of light entering the space is going to influence the surface, and we are going to notice these light, these lit surfaces. And here we have an example of a prism, and that it has the colors of the rainbow visible. What a prism does is it actually breaks down the colors. If you can imagine something like white light passing through the prism or a type of sunlight, it actually bends the amount of light passing through, and you can see these colors separately. So you'll see the red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and violet. So when it comes to color, there are pigments and light. Local color is the color that appears to our eyes as that of an object. If you see a painting where everything is realistic and that it is very natural, the artist uses natural colors, such as the grass being green, the sky being blue, the tree having brown on the trunk, and so on. That's what we call local color. The color that appears to our eyes. And when it comes to these colors, they are determined by the wavelengths of light being reflected or absorbed. In other words, when light passes through, there's actually amount of vibration that influences the light, and the more vibrations there are, it usually makes the light brighter. If you can picture a red color, it actually has a high number of wavelengths, and so it actually influences our mind a little bit. You'll notice that the color red is a very exciting color, opposed to a color like blue, where that color has less wavelengths. Therefore, when we see the color blue, especially a light blue, it doesn't exactly stimulate our mind as much as a red. And so if you notice, if you ever go to the hospital, or if you go to a nursery of some sort where there's a lot of babies, you will notice that they always have blue walls because the blue walls are there to help calm the nerves of the baby. You won't see red walls because it would excite them too much. So more characteristics of color. Achromatic is when the color has no property of hue. So achromatic basically means no color. So achromatic is basically black and white, and the combinations of grays, often referred to as neutrals. Color is distinguishable from three variables. The hue is affected by the particular wavelength of spectral color, such as green. When it comes to these distinguishable variables, we're thinking about value, and that is when it is relative to the lightness or darkness. Whenever there's a color in that you add black to that color, it becomes a shade. If you have a color and you add white to it, it becomes a tint. If you think about different colors that we like, we often like a shade of a particular color or a tint, because if we were to look at a pure saturated color on its own, it's actually very bright. Not, I would say not too many people like to wear clothes that gather that much attention. Of course, we do every now and then. There are some people that really enjoy wearing bright colors, but it seems for the good majority, people like to play it safe. So they like to wear shades or tints or neutral colors. So you'll hear intensity or saturation used a lot. It is the purity of a hue or color. And here is the color wheel, first developed in the 17th century by Isaac Newton, based on 12 pure hues. So we have the primary colors. Primary colors are red, yellow, and blue. They are primary basically due to the idea that you can't mix that color with using any other color. You can't make red, you can't make yellow, and you can't make blue. But every other color you had to mix in order to make, such as orange, green, and purple. So secondary colors are those colors that are mixed. The secondary are a mixture of the primary colors, orange, green, violet. We also have intermediate colors. They are in between the primary and secondary colors on the color wheel. These are colors like red orange, yellow green, blue violet, and red violet. Sometimes they are called tertiary colors, but for the sake of this textbook, they call it intermediate. So when it comes to the color wheel, there are actually two types, but for the most part, I would like you to remember the subtractive color mixture, because we're talking about a type of pigment that is placed over an object and that the pigment is taken away from the original surface. So things like paint or colored pencil, these are types of subtractive color mixtures. There's also the other kind of color wheel, which is an additive color wheel, and this is different in that the three light primaries are red, orange, green, and blue violet. Maybe you've heard of CMYK. It's a additive color mixture because it actually deals with light. So you'll only see this color wheel on things like lighting of some sort. You'll see CMYK on computers because it is digital. You're looking at the light underneath creating color. And so It is not a subtractive color where you are just covering something, you're covering the surface. Instead, it's an additive color because you are adding to what is already there. And there are warm and cool colors. Cool colors are usually blue, green, and purple, while warm colors are yellow, orange, and red. And here is an example of how color is mixed when it comes to printing. So when it comes to printing, it is a type of digital work, so they have to add each color separately. So you'll notice in this example here, the yellow section is separate from the magenta, and then the cyan is separated. And then we have the black. And in order for them to recreate the color, they had to put all of these layers together. And so we have color schemes. Color schemes are color groupings that provide distinct color harmonies. Many artists like to have a certain palette. It's not exactly ideal to use every color in the spectrum, so you have to be selective, and artists often create a color harmony by selecting just a few. More about color schemes, there are monochromatic. Monochromatic is when they are variations in value and intensity of a single hue. If you remember the painting that we saw by Whistler, the Nocturne in gold and blue, that was a monochromatic color scheme for the most part, especially with the blues. You'll hear this term used a lot when it comes to the color wheel as well, analogous. It is based on colors adjacent on the color wheel containing the same pure hue. So if you were to think of analogous colors, think of the colors that are right next to each other on the color wheel. So it would go from yellow to orange to red to purple to blue, and it is a very safe way to create a color scheme because they're right next to each other on the color wheel, and it's an easy way to create harmony when it comes to using color. You'll hear this term used a lot when it comes to the color wheel, complementary, when the colors are opposites of each other on the color wheel. They are called complementary. So this example here, Keith Haring, Monkey Puzzle, he puts a lot of the complementary colors together. So there is a purple outline on a design that has yellow on it. There is a red outline on a design that has purple on it. Oops, that has green on it. And then there's green within the purple. So Keith Haring does an interesting job of creating a design that incorporates complementary colors. And so we're going to talk about another visual element, texture. It is the tactile quality of a surface or visual representation of that quality. So it is, if you can imagine, touching something and noticing its quality. Is it soft? Is it smooth? Is it rough? And so on. It can be experienced through touching or visual suggestion. Actual textures can be felt, especially in three-dimensional works or architecture. There are examples of simulated or implied textures that are created to look like something other than paint. So if you are familiar with the way paint already looks, for the most part, many artists, they experiment with their brush. They probably, paint with with less pigment, or they put a, they put the pigment on a very dry brush, and they they create different textures. And that's one of the beauties behind paint, is that it is so expressive and almost uncontrollable, but at the same time, you can make so many different qualities of of color and of lines. And here we have a work by Merritt Oppenheim, Object, Breakfast in Fur. It is this example of a rude tactile experience. When we look at the object, we in a way sympathize what we are looking at. We are almost imagining ourselves using these utensils. Imagine drinking out of a cup that has this texture. It would probably make you feel a little bit uncomfortable. Imagine using a spoon that is made out of fur. And right away, I'm guessing that many of us feel a little bit uncomfortable, and that's what the artist Oppenheim does here, purposely, using texture to make us feel differently. When it comes to other objects such as pottery, there's a lot of texture happening on these objects, some very smooth areas, but there are some interesting things happening with the color, creating some different textures. And this is from the Tang Dynasty. And here is a very famous painting. It's actually a detail of a famous painting, and you're probably already aware. It is an example of The Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh. And Van Gogh is known for the way he paints, and that he does what we call an impasto style, a technique that creates simulated texture using brushstrokes of thick paint. So when it comes to this impasto style, if you can imagine holding the paintbrush and putting a lot of pigment, putting a lot of paint on the brush, and as the artist applies these brushstrokes, he's doing it rather quickly, and he's leaving a lot of it, like chunks, on the canvas. So it's very texturized. Another example of texture that can be rendered using paint is through a more indirect way of painting, where they're spending a little bit more time. It's not the same as the impasto style by Van Gogh. Instead, Jan van Eyck, in the Arnolfini portrait, made in 1434, he and many other Renaissance artists, they paint in a more methodical way, where they're just painting in glazes, so that they can make the paint very smooth and very, very accurate. And so artists are doing many different techniques when it comes to paint. Okay? And that's it for this chapter. This is probably the longest chapter in the whole book. It's a lot of information when it comes to the visual elements, so get to know them. Let me know if you have